My name is Harold Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, a retired postal worker from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I've spent the last decade of my life mostly in silence. Not because I've lost my voice, no, I can still speak just fine, but because somewhere along the way, I stopped being listened to. It's a quiet kind of disappearance, the way people fade you out when they think you've become irrelevant. My kids, Jason and Laura, they both have families of their own now. Homes in the suburbs, SUVs, demanding jobs they never seem to stop complaining about. And they have this look when they see me, like I'm a project they haven't gotten around to finishing. Or worse, something obsolete, like an old VHS tape you keep in a drawer out of guilt but never watch. I don't blame them entirely. I never asked them to come see me, never made a fuss. I suppose I thought that if I didn't interfere, they'd come of their own accord. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers when you're not holding onto it tightly. And now most weeks pass without a single phone call. My house is modest. A little one-story with faded blue siding and a back porch that groans when the wind hits it wrong. It's the same place their mother and I raised them. God, I still remember when Laura was 3 and insisted we paint the kitchen pink because she thought it would make the pancakes taste better. We did it too. One whole wall, Pepto-Bismol pink. And she beamed like she owned the world. That wall's been repainted twice since, but sometimes I still think I can see it peeking through in the right light. My wife, May, passed in '98 from ovarian cancer. That's when the silence really began. Not just in the house, but in me. She was the one who laughed loudest, who made people lean in at parties, who remembered to call the kids on their birthdays. I did my best after she was gone. I kept the fridge full, paid for Jason's second semester when he dropped out of state college and wanted to go into real estate. I drove Laura to doctor's appointments when she was on bed rest with her twins. I showed up even if I didn't always know what to say. But being dependable doesn't make you memorable. You just become the background of someone else's story. And that's what I've become to them. A background figure. Familiar but unremarkable. They say things like, "Dad's still hanging in there," as if I were a leaky faucet, a relic they tolerate. I don't dress flashy. I don't drive anything newer than my 2001 Buick. I still cut coupons from the Sunday paper and buy my socks in bulk when they're on sale. People assume that means you're poor. They think it means you've failed to climb some invisible ladder. But I never cared for ladders. I cared about peace, about privacy, about doing things the right way, even if no one noticed. I learned long ago that attention doesn't equal respect, and loud people often have the least to say. I didn't need applause. I needed enough. And I had enough. More than enough, actually. But I kept that part to myself. There's a safety in secrecy. Over the years, while Jason was flipping condos and Laura was opening and closing yoga studios, I was investing quietly. Not on Wall Street, God, no. I never trusted suits. But in small things, a few stocks here and there, modest bonds, a piece of property on Lake Pepin I bought from a retired electrician who thought he was selling to a fool. I wasn't a fool. I just didn't advertise. That's the thing people never understood about me. Just because I don't say much doesn't mean I don't see everything. I see how Jason looks around my living room like he's appraising it for resale. I see how Laura only comes when her car needs repairs, or when she wants to make sure I'm eating right, which always coincides with some new financial strain in her life. I hear the sighs, the thinly veiled impatience when I fumble with the remote or forget the name of some pop singer their kids are obsessed with. They think I'm slipping, that I'm slow, that I'm too proud or too dumb to ask for help. But the truth is, I don't ask because I don't trust them to give it without a ledger. They don't see it, but there's a cost to their kindness, a hidden bill I'm always expected to pay. And so I nod, I smile, I thank them for their concern, and I go back to living my quiet little life. Alone, maybe, but not without clarity. The irony is, they think I've become invisible, but they're the ones who've stopped looking. They don't see the envelopes I keep in the fireproof box, the handwritten ledgers with every dividend and transaction going back 30 years. They don't see the trust documents, the notarized signatures, the contingency plans. They don't see the old hunting cabin up north that's no longer a cabin at all, but a fully renovated 3-bedroom lakeside home with solar panels and hardwood floors. They don't see because they don't ask. They assume. They scoff. They calculate what they'll get when I'm gone, as if my entire worth could be tallied in a probate court. And maybe that's why I've kept it all so close. Maybe that's why I never corrected them when they called me frugal or cheap or sad. Because I needed to know who loved me for who I was, not what I had. And now, after all these years of waiting and watching, I have my answer. It's not just about the money. It's about the insult beneath the assumption. They didn't just forget me, they misjudged me. They wrote the final chapter of my story while I was still very much alive. And what they don't realize is, I've been writing my own ending this whole time, quietly, patiently, meticulously. They think the story ends with me fading out, but the truth is it hasn't even begun. Not yet. Not really. Because very soon, they're going to learn who I am. And they're going to learn it the hard way. It was Jason's boy's birthday, Tyler, turning 11. Laura had offered to host the party this year at her house in Pleasant Prairie, all granite countertops and forced smiles. I hadn't really been invited, not properly, but Laura had sent a group text that said, "Everyone's welcome. Bring good vibes." I wasn't sure if that included me, but I went anyway, picking up a Lego set Tyler had mentioned the last time he and I actually talked. I wrapped it carefully and even tied the ribbon twice to keep it neat. I wore my clean khakis and the brown cardigan May always liked on me. I remember checking myself in the mirror before leaving and thinking I looked decent. Presentable? Like someone trying? Laura greeted me at the door with a distracted hug, her phone still in her hand as she glanced over my shoulder to wave someone else in. The house smelled like vanilla candles and something reheated. Jason was already in the living room, leaning back in a recliner like he owned the place, beer in hand, talking too loudly about Bitcoin and disrupting markets. His new wife, a woman barely older than Laura, sat beside him, bored out of her mind, scrolling through something on her phone with nails like daggers. Tyler didn't say much when I gave him the gift. He mumbled thanks and tore into it without really looking at me. I stood there for a few minutes, smiling stupidly while he tossed the Lego box aside and ran off with his friends to play a virtual reality game in the basement. No one asked me to come downstairs. No one really noticed I stayed in the kitchen, leaning on the counter like an extra at someone else's life. Dinner was some kind of buffet, Laura's health-conscious lasagna, which tasted like damp cardboard, a salad that no one touched, and a tray of catered chicken wings Jason claimed to have sponsored. We sat around the dining table, the adults anyway, and Jason started in with his usual performance. He bragged about a new development property, how he was positioning it for passive cash flow, whatever that meant, and how he was coaching other investors now. Laura chimed in about a wellness retreat she wanted to launch, something to do with crystals and gut health. I said nothing. Just chewed and nodded and smiled where appropriate. I'd learned to disappear without leaving the room. But then, between bites, Jason glanced my way and said with a smirk, "So, Dad, how's the old Buick holding up? Still got all 4 wheels?" Everyone chuckled, even Laura, though she tried to look polite about it. I smiled weakly. "Still runs," I said. "She's a tough girl." Jason nodded, lips twitching. "Yeah, well, we were just saying, maybe it's time you start thinking about, downsizing, simplifying, before the upkeep becomes too much. I blinked at him. Upkeep? He leaned back, stretching like a man who'd earned the right to make decisions for others. The house, the yard. It's got to be a lot, right? We were just saying it might be smarter to sell while the market's hot. Move somewhere easier. Maybe one of those assisted communities with the nice courtyards and bingo nights. Better quality of life, you know? Laura, sensing the discomfort, tried to soften it. We just want what's best for you, Dad. You've done so much for us. It's our turn to help you. But there was that tone, that careful, condescending note that always crept in when they talked to me like I was already half gone. I looked at them both, sitting there like judges in a family tribunal, and I said, I like my house. Jason shrugged. Sure, for now. But come on, Dad, you've got to admit, it's not like you're rolling in dough. Maintenance, utilities, taxes, it all adds up. And if something big breaks, roof, furnace, do you even have savings set aside for that? That's when I felt it. The shift. The conversation had moved from light teasing to something else. Something calculated. I looked at Laura and saw it in her eyes. Hesitation, discomfort, but also agreement. She nodded slowly. We could look into some options. Places with good care, and maybe even get a good price on your house before the next winter hits. They kept talking, but their words started to blur. My ears rang slightly, a dull thrum behind my temples, not from rage, but from clarity. This wasn't concern. This was strategy. They were planning my life like a spreadsheet, calculating my trajectory toward death, and dividing up the remainder like vultures hovering at a polite distance. It was all so tidy, so reasonable. I could barely breathe from how neat it all sounded. I stood up quietly. No one noticed at first. I picked up my plate, dumped the rest of my meal in the trash, and carried the dish to the sink. Laura looked up. You don't have to. I know, I said, and rinsed the plate carefully, like I always did after meals at home, like I would have done for May. Jason chuckled. Don't be dramatic, Dad. We're just talking about the future, being realistic. I turned slowly and looked at him. Is that what this is? Well, yeah. You're not exactly flush, are you? And then he laughed again. Unless you've been hiding a couple million somewhere, right? That was the moment. That word, flush. The assumption of my failure, spoken like a punchline. And the worst part was, everyone laughed. Even Laura, even the wife with the dagger nails. They all found the idea of me having anything of value absurd. Hilarious. I nodded once, said nothing, walked to the front door, and picked up my coat. You leaving already? Laura asked. Yeah, I said. Long day. Jason raised his beer in mock toast. Take care of yourself, Dad. Don't worry. We'll figure something out for you. I walked out into the cold night, got into my old Buick, and sat there for a while with the engine off. I watched the house through the windshield. The windows glowed warm and yellow, full of people who claimed to be my family. I felt the weight of something inside me shift, the way a fault line does before it snaps. That night I didn't sleep. I sat up in my armchair until morning, the banking folder on my lap, the one with all the papers they didn't know existed, the one they never thought to ask about. And as the sun rose over the brittle horizon, I opened it. For the first time in years, I was ready to let them see exactly how wrong they were. In the days that followed that birthday dinner, something in the air between us shifted, subtly at first, then more openly, as if some veil had been pulled back and no one bothered to pretend anymore. I didn't hear from either Jason or Laura for nearly 2 weeks, and that silence used to bother me once, used to make me wonder if they were just busy, just overwhelmed with life. But after what they'd said, the jokes, the dismissive way they'd written me off as a burden, that silence became something else entirely, an insult layered with calculation. And then, as if on cue, the real descent began. It started with a letter I hadn't expected. A notice from a property appraiser saying that someone had requested an informal evaluation of my home for resale purposes. I sat at my kitchen table and read the envelope twice, then a third time, trying to figure out whether it was some kind of clerical error. But there it was, plain as day. My address, my name, and a return contact number that traced back to a realty office owned by an associate of Jason's. I didn't call him right away. I didn't call anyone. I just folded the letter, tucked it into the drawer beneath my checkbook, and stared at the wood grain on the table for a long time. That night I barely slept, not from anger, but from a dawning realization that the conversation at the party wasn't just casual musing. It was a prelude, a first step. Jason, who once couldn't file his taxes without asking me how exemptions worked, was now laying tracks to carve up my life like a foreclosure. Still, I told myself it might be a misunderstanding, that maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe Laura didn't even know. But then came the second blow, and it landed harder than I expected. I received a call from my bank's fraud alert department. Routine, they said. There had been a request to access certain financial documents linked to my account. They were flagged as unusual because the access attempt had been initiated using a scanned power of attorney form, signed supposedly by me. I asked for a copy. They emailed it to me, and I stared at the screen in disbelief. My name, my handwriting, or a close approximation, and Jason's signature beneath mine. I knew I hadn't signed that document. I hadn't authorized anyone to act on my behalf, especially not regarding finances. The form had been dated just 3 days after the party. I didn't call him. I called my lawyer. Charles Kemp has been my legal counsel since 1989, a man who still uses a flip phone and keeps everything in hard copy. He drove over that afternoon with his leather briefcase and a quiet, measured tone I had always appreciated. I showed him the printouts, the appraiser's letter, and the fake power of attorney. He read each piece in silence, then looked up at me. "This was deliberate," he said. "He's trying to get access to your estate. Probably thinks you're losing grip or that you won't notice." I nodded slowly. "They think I'm broke." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to prove otherwise?" I didn't answer him right away. I went to the hallway closet, took out the fireproof lockbox I'd kept there for over 20 years, and placed it on the table. I opened it slowly, revealing bank statements, stock certificates, property deeds, and a trust draft I had prepared but never signed. Charles's eyes widened, just slightly. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "they're in for a surprise." But I wasn't interested in shock value. I didn't want revenge in the theatrical sense. I didn't want to embarrass them at Christmas dinner or stand up in church with a speech. I wanted them to feel the silence they'd forced me into. I wanted them to see the weight of all the years they'd treated me like a background fixture, a ghost, in their upward mobility. I wanted the truth of who I was, what I had built, what I had preserved, to sit on their conscience like a stone they'd swallowed whole. So I asked Charles to initiate a formal response to the bank, revoke the false document, flag the attempt as fraudulent, and register my accounts under new protections. Then I made an appointment with a notary. I was done waiting for respect to arrive out of sentimentality. I was going to earn it through absence. In the following weeks, Jason and Laura both reached out, first with generic messages, then with sudden, enthusiastic offers to drop by. Laura texted a photo of a coupon booklet for retirement communities, adding a cheerful note, Some of these look really nice, Dad. Thought you'd want options. Jason called twice, left voicemails. The tone had changed. Less mocking, more upbeat. Like a salesman calling after you've already left the dealership. I didn't answer either one. I spent my mornings reviewing documents with Charles and my afternoons walking through the woods near the lake house they didn't know I owned. It had taken me years to fix that place up. New insulation, solar panels, plumbing upgrades, but it was quiet now. Beautiful in its simplicity. I slept there the first night after the notary stamped my trust documents, and for the first time in a long time, I slept deeply. They had tried to erase me in advance, to speak about my future like it was a math problem with one correct answer, but they had no idea what equations I'd been solving on my own for decades. I had watched them stumble through their 20s, flail through their 30s, and now, in their 40s, they thought they'd mastered the world. But they had never mastered themselves. They saw my frugality as failure. They saw my silence as surrender. And now they were seeing ghosts in my bank account, wondering where the money went, where it had ever been, how they could have missed it. I let them wonder. Let them talk to each other in whispers and come up with theories. It wasn't about the money. It was about what they never thought to value. And if they couldn't see that, then maybe they never deserved to. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon. The kind of cold, gray Wisconsin day that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I was sitting in the sunroom of the lake house, which hadn't seen guests in years and still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco. I had just come back from the bank in town, where I finalized the transfer of assets into the newly formed trust. Everything was in place now, secure, documented, shielded from the hands that had grown eager too early. It wasn't just the money that was protected. It was my intention, my dignity, my name. I sat there watching a pair of loons skim across the lake's surface, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt clean. Not rich, not powerful, but clean, unburdened. And then my phone rang. It was Laura, though I didn't recognize the number. She was calling from her office, or more likely from a colleague's line, to avoid being ignored. I answered, more out of curiosity than kindness. Her voice was bright, falsely casual, like someone trying to sell you a vacation package you never signed up for. She asked how I was doing, if I needed anything, if I'd seen the news about the storm coming next week. I could hear the calculation underneath every syllable, the way her words danced around the real reason for the call. After a few pleasantries, she shifted. Jason mentioned you might be making some big decisions soon, she said, her tone dropping half a note. We just want to be supportive, Dad. We've been talking a lot, and we feel like maybe it's time we all sat down and discussed the future. Your future. I paused. What about it? She exhaled gently, a rehearsed sigh. Well, it's just, with everything going on, we think it's important to make sure your affairs are in order. If something were to happen, God forbid, we don't want to be scrambling. It's about peace of mind. Really? I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I said slowly, What affairs are you referring to? She hesitated, clearly flustered. Just, estate planning, living arrangements, making sure you're set up with medical directives. Jason said you've been a little forgetful lately. And with the bank thing, we were worried you might be vulnerable. There it was. Vulnerable. That word again. The word they leaned on when they wanted to wrest control under the pretense of care. I asked her plainly if she and Jason had spoken to my bank, if they had tried to access my accounts. She immediately became defensive, insisting that Jason was only checking for any red flags because they were concerned about scams, elder fraud, the usual excuses. I thanked her for her concern and hung up. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but the taste of it lingered all day. They weren't backing off. They were regrouping, reframing the approach. They didn't understand that the game they were playing was already over, that the assets were no longer accessible to them, that even if I dropped dead that second, not a single dollar would pass through their hands unless the terms I'd written allowed it, and those terms were ironclad. That night, I reviewed the trust documents again, every clause and codicil. I had named only one beneficiary, my granddaughter Sarah, Laura's daughter, now 19, and in her second year at a community college in Eau Claire. Sarah had always been different, quiet, like me. She'd come by last Christmas with a tin of homemade cookies and a book of crossword puzzles she thought I'd enjoy. She hadn't asked for anything. She'd sat with me for almost an hour, talking about a literature class she liked, asking about how I met her grandmother. She hadn't even known about the money. But something in her presence reminded me of who I used to be. Curious, attentive, kind, without agenda. I'd asked Charles to write in specific stipulations. Sarah would receive control of the trust at age 25, provided she graduated college and did not share any financial disbursement with her parents. Any attempt to funnel money through her to Jason or Laura would void the trust. I had even included a clause that required annual proof of separation. No joint accounts, no co-signatures, nothing that would allow the funds to leak back to the people who had abandoned decency for the illusion of inheritance. The midpoint wasn't some grand confrontation or shouting match. It was quieter than that. It was the moment I realized that I no longer felt fear, not of death, not of their judgment, not of being alone. I had done something irreversible, not just legally, but emotionally. I had chosen to see them as they truly were, without the haze of nostalgia or obligation. And in doing so, I had stepped out of the role they had written for me. I was no longer the aging patriarch waiting to be managed. I was a man with clarity, with the rare luxury of time and truth. And in that clarity, I saw the shape of what would come next. They would grow more desperate. They would lie more convincingly. They might even cry. But the decision had already been made. And the moment I placed my trust, both financial and emotional, in someone who had never once asked me to, that's when everything truly changed. It wasn't long after that quiet shift that the escalation began in earnest, this time with less subtlety and more desperation, as though the slow dripping suspicion that had fermented inside Jason and Laura had finally reached a boil. The warning signs came not as calls or texts, but in the form of formal letters, veiled inquiries, and the sudden appearance of third parties who had no business in my affairs. The first was a letter from a financial advisor I had never contacted, someone affiliated with a firm that Jason once mentioned during his endless monologues about tax shelters and capital gains. The letter was dressed in the language of polite concern, suggesting a free consultation to help review and optimize my estate planning strategy, citing vague legal changes and potential vulnerabilities in elder financial protection. I knew exactly what it was: bait. A cleverly disguised attempt to position themselves within reach of my assets under the guise of professional stewardship. I didn't respond. I handed the letter to Charles, who added it to the growing file we had started to compile, a dossier of quiet manipulations. But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, I received a notice from the county clerk's office. A formal request had been filed by my own daughter to initiate an inquiry into my capacity to manage financial decisions independently. It was couched in euphemisms, referencing signs of cognitive decline, recent confusion, and concern for my well-being. My heart didn't break. No, that would have implied shock. Instead, I felt a sharp, metallic click inside, like a key turning in a lock I had always known was there, but never dared use. She had gone this far. Laura, the little girl who once cried when I missed her ballet recital, had now decided I needed to be legally constrained. They were playing the long game now, angling to establish a guardianship that would give them legal access to my financial decisions under the pretense of care. I wasn't entirely surprised. Jason had always been the more aggressive one, the talker, the schemer. But Laura, her betrayal was quieter, wrapped in sweetness, cloaked in maternal words, and that made it hurt more. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, mistaken my aging body for a feeble mind. But I was sharper now than I had been in years, fueled not by anger, but by an emerging clarity that cut through every delusion I had once held about the nature of family. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with Charles, going over the court documents she had filed, and asking him, not rhetorically, how do they sleep at night? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because the truth is, people like Jason and Laura don't see it as betrayal. They see it as pragmatism. They convince themselves that their actions are born of concern, necessity, logic. They write their own morality, tailored to fit whatever decision they've already made. They sleep fine because they believe they're right, or at least entitled. And that belief is stronger than guilt, stronger than blood. But what they didn't realize was that I had already anticipated this move. Long before any court petition, I had quietly visited a neuropsychologist twice, in fact. Not because I feared my mind was slipping, but because I knew they would one day claim it had. I submitted to memory tests, executive function assessments, even coordination evaluations. I had every session documented and notarized. My cognitive scores placed me in the top percentile for my age group. I wasn't slipping, I was preparing. Because there's a certain dignity in meeting betrayal not with vengeance, but with proof. With cold, undeniable records that strip the lie naked. When their petition was officially denied by the court for lack of evidence, Laura left me a voicemail. Her voice was strained, as if rehearsed through clenched teeth. I just wanted to say I'm sorry if we upset you. That wasn't our intention. We just want you to be okay. You know we love you. I didn't return the call. What could I have said that wouldn't come out as poison? But I did listen to the message again and again, not for the words, but for the absence in them. The lack of shame, the sterile logic of someone who still believed she could rewrite the damage with a warm enough tone. They thought they were losing something they were never entitled to in the first place. They had confused proximity with ownership. And now, having failed legally, they pivoted again, this time toward performance. Jason showed up at my house 2 days later, unannounced, with coffee and a forced grin, the kind that stretches too wide and never reaches the eyes. I didn't invite him in. We sat on the porch, where the wind could carry the lies away before they settled. He talked about misunderstandings, about concern gone too far. Then he asked the question he'd come to ask, the only one that mattered to him. Dad, are you really planning to cut us out? He didn't even try to hide the motive anymore. Not even a gesture of humility, no moment of reflection, no acknowledgement of what they'd done. Just that single question, sharpened like a blade. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the late nights I spent helping him study for his real estate license. The time I drove 6 hours to bail him out after his DUI. The loan I gave him in 2008 that he never paid back. I thought about Laura's piano recitals, the way she used to rest her head on my shoulder during thunderstorms. The night I stayed up sewing the hem of her graduation gown because she hadn't noticed it had torn. I thought about all of it, and then I answered, "Yes." He flinched, as if struck. "Seriously?" he said, his voice rising. "After everything? You're going to do this to your own family?" I didn't say another word. I stood, walked to the door, and closed it behind me, leaving him on the porch with his lukewarm coffee and his manufactured outrage. What followed was a barrage. Emails, calls, letters, some from Jason, some from Laura, a few from mutual acquaintances suddenly interested in reconnecting. I ignored them all. I had drawn the line, and now I stood on the side where dignity lived, where peace wasn't bought with silence. But the most telling moment came not from Jason or Laura, but from Sarah. One evening she called me, not out of obligation, not because someone told her to, but because she had heard about the court petition from her mother and was confused and a little scared. She asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I could hear her sincerity through the phone, raw and unscripted. I told her the truth, not everything, not the full depth of what had happened, but enough for her to understand that I wasn't angry. I was simply done pretending. And then she said something I'll never forget. You don't owe them your forgiveness just because they share your last name. That was when I knew I had chosen the right heir. Not because she said what I wanted to hear, but because she understood something fundamental, that love without respect is just entitlement with better manners. By the end of that week, Charles and I completed the final stage. We filed the trust documents with a secondary attorney for independent verification and future protection, should anything happen to me unexpectedly. I drafted a personal letter to accompany the documents, one for Sarah, explaining why I had done what I did, what I hoped she would use the inheritance for, and what I hoped she would never forget. Not about me, but about herself. That she was enough. That she didn't have to prove her worth through proximity or performance. That love, the real kind, doesn't demand proof of profitability. I sealed the letter and placed it in the box that would be delivered to her on her 25th birthday. Jason and Laura didn't know any of this. All they saw was a father slipping away, not physically, but from their grasp. They had spent so long seeing me as a wallet in waiting, as an inevitable payout, that they had never stopped to see the man who had spent his life making sure they never felt the kind of fear I now lived with daily. The fear of dying unloved, unvalued, unseen. But that fear had passed now. In its place stood something far more powerful: resolve. And in that resolve, I found not just justice, but liberation. It was Laura who made the final move, or perhaps she was just the messenger of Jason's strategy. Either way, she was the one who came to the door that day, unannounced but strangely composed, wearing her nicest coat and a look I had not seen on her face since she was a child, trying to win back a toy she had thrown in a tantrum. I'd seen it all before. The soft voice, the eyes made wet not from sorrow but from intention, the posture of someone rehearsing sincerity because it had once worked. She stood on my porch holding a folder in her arms and said, "Dad, I think we should talk." I didn't invite her in immediately. I stood in the doorway for a moment, measuring her. Behind her, the wind stirred the trees in the yard, and the late October light made everything look older. I stepped aside and motioned toward the living room. She entered cautiously, like someone entering sacred ground, and sat where her mother used to sit when reading the newspaper on Sundays. That detail hit me more than anything she said in the next few minutes. She began with an apology. Not a real one, of course, but one of those half measures that imply mutual blame. "I think things got out of hand," she said. "We just wanted to protect you." I said nothing. She waited, then launched into her next phase. She talked about family, about unity, about how money had come between people she loved, how Jason might have acted rashly, how she wished she had handled things differently. I still didn't speak. I let her empty the well of her justifications, her almost regrets, her well-curated narrative. And then she opened the folder. Inside were several printed documents, new medical evaluations, a proposed joint financial oversight agreement, A draft power of attorney, fresh this time, properly formatted, not forged. She laid them on the coffee table one by one, like cards in a final hand. "We just think this is safer," she said, voice careful, almost trembling. "You keep full control, of course, but Jason and I would just have oversight. For emergencies. Just in case." That last part, just in case, hung in the air like smoke. I looked at the papers, not reading them, but letting my eyes rest on them. They had shifted tactics again, from aggression to persuasion, from legal force to cooperative manipulation. It was impressive in its way, like watching stage actors adjust to a new scene without missing a beat. And then I stood up. I walked to my desk in the corner of the room, opened the drawer, and took out a thick envelope. I returned to the coffee table and placed it next to her documents. "What's this?" she asked. "Bank statement," I said. "The most recent one. The full balance," she blinked. "You're showing me your statement?" "No," I said. "I'm showing you the reason you will never touch a cent of it." She looked at me then, not with confusion, not with pain, but with calculation, the way someone glances at a closing door and estimates whether they can reach it before the lock clicks shut. She opened the envelope and scanned the first page. Her face didn't change, not dramatically. She was too practiced for that. But her silence told the truth. She saw the number. The real number. She saw the 6 digits before the decimal, the accumulated sum of decades of restraint, planning, and quiet vigilance. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She swallowed. "How?" she whispered. "How did you—" "By not living the way you live," I answered. "By not treating people like obstacles or banks. By knowing that being quiet doesn't mean being weak." She put the paper down slowly, hands trembling now, not from guilt, but from the realization that her entire premise, the idea that I needed her, that I had become something to manage, was a lie. She looked up at me, something faltering in her eyes. "You could have told us," she said. "We thought—" "You thought I was poor," I interrupted. "You thought I was slow and soft and ripe for claiming. You thought you were circling a hollow man, one last grasp at a life you never bothered to understand." Her face changed then. Her composure cracked. "I'm your daughter," she said, as if the word itself were supposed to absolve everything. "And I'm your father," I replied quietly. "Not your project, not your retirement plan." We sat in silence. The room felt heavy. She reached for the folder with the documents she had brought and began to gather them. I stopped her. "Leave those," I said. "I want to remember what you thought I would agree to." She froze, then stood, the envelope with the bank statement still on the table between us. "Are you really cutting us out?" she asked again, softer this time. "All of it?" I nodded once. "All of it." Her lips pressed into a tight line, as if she wanted to say something cruel, but couldn't find the right shape for it. And then she turned and left. That night I went to the lake house. I lit a fire and sat on the back porch wrapped in the old flannel blanket May had loved. The stars were so bright it hurt to look at them. I felt not triumphant, not victorious, but intact. That was the only word for it. I had survived the erosion of something sacred, had walked through the fire they lit under the illusion of love and come out whole. I had nothing more to say to them, no final letters, no clarifying explanations. They had made their values clear, and I had made mine unmovable. In the weeks that followed Laura's visit, the silence returned, but this time it wore a different face. Not the quiet of neglect, but the strained stillness of a closed door. No more phone calls, no messages, no sudden drop-ins or friendly gestures. It was as though upon seeing the number on that bank statement, the reality of who I was, not who they imagined, but who I had actually been all along, had forced them to retreat. Perhaps they were embarrassed. Perhaps they were strategizing again, waiting for another opening. But none came, because there would be no reconciliation, no reheated version of family dinners, no redemptive arc in which they rediscovered their love for their old father. I'd taken away the illusion of control they'd been building for years, and with it, I had taken away their leverage. And what remained between us now was not hatred, but something colder. Irrelevance. Not mine, but theirs. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to call every Sunday. Sometimes she'd talk about school, her new job at the bookstore, or a book she thought I might like. Sometimes she just called to say hello. She never once asked about money. She didn't even know she was the sole beneficiary. I hadn't told her, and I didn't plan to. Not yet. She had earned it without asking, and I wanted her to keep earning it through the simple act of being herself, the way she showed up, the way she asked questions and actually listened, the way she didn't treat me like a museum exhibit. I had started writing letters to her, not for now, but for later. Little reflections, memories, advice I thought might matter when I was gone. They were full of things I wished I'd said to May when I had the chance. Things I wished someone had said to me when I was Sarah's age. I kept them in a wooden box under my bed, labeled simply, "For when I'm gone." It felt right leaving something that mattered behind. Something more than money. Something truer. As winter settled in, I moved fully into the lake house. I didn't tell anyone. I just packed up a few essentials from the old place, left the thermostat low, and drove north with the Buick loaded down like I was heading into exile. But it didn't feel like exile. It felt like freedom. The cabin was quiet, yes, but never empty. The wind had its own voice, and the trees creaked like they were remembering old stories. I spent my mornings walking by the frozen lake, afternoons reading or fixing little things that didn't need fixing, and evenings watching the sun vanish behind the pines, grateful for the silence I had once feared. I wasn't lonely, I was alone, but that wasn't the same thing anymore. I had faced down the worst fear a man like me can have, not death, but being discarded while still breathing, and I had survived it with my name intact. Occasionally someone from town would stop by, a neighbor bringing firewood, a kid selling cookies, a church volunteer checking on Mr. Whitmore. I welcomed them kindly, offered hot cocoa, chatted for a bit, and watched them leave. I wasn't hiding. I had nothing to hide. I had simply withdrawn from the economy of affection that had tried to buy and sell me like a share on the stock market. I had opted out, and in that withdrawal, I found clarity. I found the shape of myself again, not as a father or a provider or a man to be managed, but as a human being with limits, with pride, with a quiet flame still burning. And so, the story ends not with a reunion, not with courtroom battles or media spectacles, but with the sound of snow falling on the roof of a lake house owned by a man everyone once assumed was poor. A man they laughed at, a man they tried to rewrite into something convenient, but I'm still here. Not rich in the way they understand, but rich enough to choose who I become in the final chapters of my life. Rich enough to give without being taken from. Rich enough to be forgotten by those who never knew me and remembered by the one who truly did.